started. So Julie, I'm so glad to talk to you. Thank you for making a little time. You founded the Urban Innovation Fund. You also founded another fund and organization known as TUML. So you've been doing this for a while. I was curious, could you introduce yourself, tell me a little bit about how Urban Innovation Fund got started, and maybe a bit about the ways that Urban Innovation Fund are different from your classic VC. Could we kind of start there?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. It's great to be here. As Doug mentioned, my name is Julie. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of the Urban Innovation Fund. We are a venture capital firm that invests in startups shaping the future of cities. So we invest across a variety of verticals, what you might consider more traditional smart cities sectors. So think transportation, energy, and water. But we also like to think more expansively around the quality of living in cities. So we end up investing in areas like fintech and the future of work. Really, the commonality is that goal of growing and scaling our startups to cities across the globe. We are looking to get involved with startups very early stage. We get involved with the pre-seed and seed, typically as one of the lead, co-lead, or large syndicate partners at that stage. And in addition to providing capital, we also like to emphasize regulatory support, since we've seen that be an area of need for startups. In terms of how I got here, so I first started working at a startup called Revolution Foods over in Oakland. It was a very transformative experience. I ended up going to business school where I met my co-founder, Clara. She had been working for a startup in what we would call the urban innovation space, though we didn't recognize it at the time. She had been working for a startup called Fundrise in Washington, D.C. They crowdfund dollars from the community to invest in institutional real estate within that community. And we just realized that these startups had something in common. You know, they were tackling these core urban challenges. They were growing and scaling in really transformative ways. And oftentimes they faced regulatory and political pushback as they grew and scaled. And so we ended up launching TUML, an accelerator program, in 2013. We incubated 38 startups in what we started calling the urban innovation space. And we used that kind of experience with those startups to launch the Urban Innovation Fund about 4 years ago now. Through the fund, we've invested in about 30 startups, and we're excited to meet and chat with any new entrepreneurs or startups that are getting off the ground. We love being that first institutional check in the door and providing advice and support. So I'll pause there since that's a lot of information, but we're really excited to see all of the innovations that folks around the Prospect Silicon Valley community are working on.
Great. So I'm curious, when you look at startups under the fund and you look at prospective investments, are you looking at startups whose customers are primarily commercial? You know, is it a B2B or business to consumer? Are you also looking at business to government? What's kind of your thesis on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to B2B versus B2C versus B2G, we're pretty agnostic, and we've supported startups across, you know, the spectrum. I would say the vast majority of our companies have been B2B or B2C. I would say about probably less than 10% have fallen into that selling directly to government as their first customer. And that doesn't mean we won't do it, but we really want to see a pathway where those companies can grow and scale quickly. And I think there are stereotypes some people push back on, which is that government has a slower sales cycle. I just think anytime you're dealing with a large entity where, you know, it's bureaucratic and there are big loopholes to jump through, I would say the same thing applies to big enterprises as well. You have to show a pathway to be able to execute and scale those types of sales. And so what we've actually seen work really well for our companies is when they start selling either B2B or B2C first, and then they expand to B2G. And so kind of a substantive example of that, at our accelerator, we were the first investor in a crowdsourced commuter shuttle company called Chariot. And Chariot essentially started as a B2C service. They were, basically helping commuters from San Francisco get from home to work and back. And then it was once they really had some traction on the B2C side, they actually ended up garnering some B2B traction with larger companies like Sephora, who wanted access to getting shuttles for their employees. And then they ultimately attracted B2G customers, including the city of San Francisco, who wanted to use Chariot to augment their night owl service. And so I think there are opportunities like that where if you're focusing on speed and execution, you can actually, hit quite a few different types of customer segments. It just all depends on that ability to sell into, whatever entity it may be.
Right. I mean, we definitely see that, in large institutional procurement, a lot of municipalities and such, it's a really complicated situation. And it's not just that they're slow and methodical. Sometimes there are even barriers to them getting to what they really want. So we see a disconnect between their kind of procurement streams and their sustainability goals, for example. And that, they may have the best of intentions, but sometimes, either their process and policy or just their organization or a lack of info or using kind of the wrong tool sets can kind of get in the way. And that's actually something that we're working on called Empower Procurement, where we are, working with a number of municipalities around the state of California, and we hope a whole lot more to try to start to unlock some of those barriers so that there's perhaps a little straighter line to revenue on the startup side for sure. So we definitely appreciate that comment.
And, one thing that I would add to, your point here is that's extremely important, and being able to navigate that procurement cycle or sales cycle is extremely valuable for startups. But I think more than that, startups really need to understand that there is a different way of thinking within government when they're approaching folks. And so it's not about being the most innovative or finding, the coolest solution. A lot of times, I think what folks within the government sphere really value is, safety, access, and fairness. And so, they're not necessarily incentivized to, take on the newest innovation or try out something that, frankly could fail in a couple of years. They want something that will be around, will have longevity, for lack of a better phrase. It's that whole, you don't get fired for buying IBM type of mentality. And I think, it's starting to change, but there just isn't a lot of incentive to change it extremely quickly. And oftentimes that can be a disincentive for working with early stage startups.
Right. So, I will mention for everybody that is kind of viewing now, if you do have questions, you can post them in the Q&A box that's down below there. We'll be happy to kind of get some of those answered. There was a question, and I just want to kind of try to work this into the conversation. Do you think that crowdfunding is a plus or a minus when it comes to that kind of, let's say, startup model?
Yeah.
In this case?
Well, thanks, Brett, for that question. And just to clarify, so my co-founder, Clara, had worked for a startup that basically used a new form of crowdfunding to help regular investors basically get access to institutional real estate deals. So it's a little bit different from crowdfunding a startup, but they did rely on kind of regulations that helped get people access to a new investing vehicle. To your question more broadly, I think that there are more startups that now are using crowdfunding, and there are different, kind of pros and cons to the approach. It is something that some of our startups have done, but to be honest, most startups I do see taking a more traditional path, meaning that they'll usually do, a round of either friends and family or angel funding, accelerator funding. Then ultimately they might go for a pre-seed round, kind of somewhere in that 500K to 1 million range. And that's typically when, you might get your first fund involved, and then they'll go into more of an institutional round with seed funds and maybe later life cycle funds. I think crowdfunding could be an effective mechanism, but it is still one that has its own challenges and barriers to entry. So I would say that I don't think there's a problem with it. I haven't seen it be as pervasive as I think some people thought it would be when the regulations initially eased around it. And we can kind of talk about pros and cons, but I do still think that it takes a while to do it. You have to control a lot of folks, and making sure that you use a platform that only one person goes on your cap table, because otherwise it creates a really messy capitalization structure.
I could imagine and I think it's a really good point. So, how long do you track your investments? When you make an investment and they move on to other investors or they grow. Are you tracking these for long term? And are you also looking at kind of, what kind of social impact you think your fund is creating? Could you maybe make a comment or two about that?
Sure. So I think, a typical VC fund life cycle is 10 years. And oftentimes for these companies, they can go on much longer than that. So for us, we're extremely active as soon as we invest. We obviously, are kind of extremely hands-on and supportive very early on. And then once the company gets to that next stage of funding, typically seed, Series A, beyond, we continue to track, we continue to be involved, but we can kind of downgrade our involvement. So that way it's not necessarily the, kind of monthly standing calls, the monthly check-in meetings, but we try to be a very active and supportive investor throughout the company's life cycle. We do think it's appropriate at times to kind of step off boards depending on the remaking of boards at certain stages. So typically Series A, Series B, and beyond. And I think for us, it's, hey, we're still tracking, we're getting involved, but we're also leaving room for that next level of growth. In terms of tracking impact, I think that is something that, can be talked about to death. But, ultimately for us, we think that, more money equals more impact. So every startup that we support, we believe that they will have a positive impact on our cities. And even if they don't, self-identify as impact-based startups, which frankly, I think most entrepreneurs are too busy, building their own businesses to really, give themselves those types of monikers. I think, we really see that in their business model, they're having a positive influence on cities. They're able to kind of grow and scale. And as they grow and create more momentum and reach out to other cities, that they're really perpetuating that impact in every place that they go. And so for us, we think of it as a virtuous cycle.
Oh, very good. So just, I guess I wanted to, you mentioned Chariot as an investment, and they definitely made a mark. I'm wondering if you've got some other success stories more recently that you're excited about.
Yeah, so for us, the fund, the Urban Innovation Fund, is just under 4 years old. So we're still early, but we're pretty excited about a lot of the companies that are kind of going through. I'll mention a couple here that might be more relevant to this community. So one of our recent investments is in a company called Electrify. They're a software. Yep, I know that they are part of this kind of community, and they're awesome. Started by just a really fantastic and experienced tech team, EV team, but essentially they're creating a software platform for electric vehicle fleets. So they're helping that electrification movement. They have a very simple and easy to understand product where they can help you manage your charging. They could also look at things like faults in your vehicles, help you map out where your electric vehicles are kind of stationed, what their energy usage is. And so they really provide that, fleet platform through a software asset-light solution, which we're pretty excited about. We have a number of other startups in kind of the broader energy and water space. Another one that I might point to in the transportation space, since I know you guys do a lot there, we have a company in our portfolio called Ride Report, which is essentially a management and compliance software for cities that help them look at e-scooter and e-bike usage within their city. And so they can manage compliance, regulation, ultimately pricing as well, and permitting for those vehicles. And, we think that's a really interesting company. We got involved in their seed. They've since raised a $10 million Series A. And one of the things that we think is really compelling about them is, in addition to being asset light, they're really one of those tools that can be used for all cities, regardless of which hardware operators are there. So, regardless of whether you're using Bird, Lein, Skip, Scoot, or any of the myriad of other options, they're really more of kind of that picks and shovels approach to, we believe that long-term micromobility will be one of the form factors that people are using to commute around cities. And as part of that, we think that it's important to have, a really robust software that can help you visualize where all those scooters and bikes are deployed, help you regulate them appropriately for your city, and ultimately extract, permits and payment from those operators.
Great. I'm kind of amazed, but we're out of time. We had a great conversation with you. I'm just really excited, and we're really grateful that you're doing what you're doing with Urban Innovation Fund. And I trust that everything is also going well with your co-founder, and really appreciate your time this morning and being able to connect with you and have everybody kind of get to know what you're doing a little better.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and looking forward to learning more about what all of you guys are working on too.
Cool, great. We have shared Julie's info and Urban Innovations Fund's Twitter in the chat, so make sure you can capture that. And thanks everybody. Have a wonderful morning, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.